Hello everyone, this is Mixed Media in Simple Steps, and I want to show you some things that you can do with stencils. You can do a lot of different things with stencils. So the first thing, before I get my paper all wet, is a pen. You can use pencil, markers, anything, but get your stencil out there and just outline the stencil. Use the stencil as a guide for your pen or your pencil. And you don't have to fill in all the spaces, but you can. And not only can you outline, but you can also scribble or Zen doodle inside the shapes for a different effect. I'm going to scribble in this one. Scribble. Put some lines. Kind of fill it in. Just some fun stuff. Outline that one. So you have a bit of the design underneath. All right. Fill it in, outline your stencil, whatever you want to do. Pens, pencils, markers are a lot of fun to use. All right. So let's get to acrylic paint. I know, a lot of people don't like to stencil because the stencil doesn't turn out the way they want the stencil to turn out. Let's do a very traditional acrylic paint with stencil. All right, I'm going to use the same stencil. In fact, I'm going to use this stencil for this whole page here. These pages I'm layering up with all this mixed media. We'll see what happens with them as we go. The trick with a makeup sponge and acrylic paint is dab off that paint until you think there isn't any paint left on that sponge. Dab it off in a place that's pretty dry on your palette. When you think there isn't any paint on your makeup sponge, then pounce it on the stencil. Pounce it up and down for crisp stencil lines. Thought that there wasn't any paint on that stencil, but look at all that paint. If you just dip your brush or your makeup sponge in that paint and don't dab it off, that's when you get the imperfect stenciling. And that may be what you want. I like to do things differently sometimes, and so not having a perfect stencil every time makes me happy. So that's a makeup sponge. You could also use a sponge pouncer. Same thing. You want to dab off some of that and go up and down. It gives you a light little stencil, or you can kind of rub it, twist it. Make it a little darker. That works too. And another thing that you can use is a stencil brush. These are flat on the top. Needs more paint. So you just get paint on the very tip. Maybe I should find another spot here so you can see. And then dab it up and down. until you've covered the area that you want covered. It may not be the entire stencil. It may be only a part of the stencil. But it's just a little bit different. All right. Another thing that I like to do with my stencils, and I'm going to do a different one. Actually, there is paint on this stencil. And so I am going to take a baby wipe, kind of a used one that's been, it's a little dry. But I am going to clean off my stencil right there on my page. I'm going to take the paint that's on the stencil and rub it to the paper. This cleans off my stencil. And it leaves all that paint on your page. It's not really clear. It's a little lighter than the others, but it works. And the other thing that I like to do with acrylic paint, let's find a page where you can actually see what's going on. Let me use this stencil. And I guess we can use the same color since I have it out here on my palette. A kitchen sponge works as well. I forgot to show that one. A kitchen sponge. Dab it off so that it's there and dab it on. This gives you not quite a solid stenciling. It's more of a light spattering. But sometimes you want something just a little less out there, okay? And then the last thing to do is use a soft brush. I love this technique. It's one of my favorites. Let's get some paint out there. The reason I like this one is it's different. I use a soft brush and I brush the paint back and forth. I scrub it into the stencil. This is going to be an imperfect thing. It's going to give you surprises every time. It's never going to turn out the same exact way. But you want quite a bit of paint. And what you're doing is you're brushing that paint underneath the stencil. And the stencil is kind of holding it in place there. Okay? So when I lift up my stencil, oh, I got a little bit, I didn't get enough paint on some of this. When I lift up my stencil, you can see that where the stencil was touching the paper, that paint got trapped in there, and you have a raised bit. Now that raised bit will actually dry so that you have texture on your page. This is the area I didn't get enough paint, and so it left the stencil mark there. But I love the way that works. I really like that a lot. Let me take my baby wipe and just clean off the acrylic paint. Acrylic paint will dry on your stencil. Sometimes it's hard to scrub it off, make it clean again. You do want to clean up your sponges immediately. You don't want that to dry because the sponge will, as soon as that paint dries in your sponge, you can't use it anymore. In your brushes too. It'll dry in your brushes and then it's not as good to use. I use these makeup sponges over and over and over again. And what I do is I run them under water and I squeeze them until I don't see any more color come out of them. and I use them again and again and again. All right, so let's go on to, let me clean up this palette because I'm going to need to use that again. Don't usually waste paint like that. Let's go on to an ink pad. Here is just a regular, I'm not sure what kind of ink pad it is. Let's use a makeup sponge and this ink pad. And the trick is just to dab it, not to rub too much, so that you don't rub the color underneath the stencil. You want to be able to see the pattern. Just like that. Okay. Here's a different stencil. Another thing that I like to do, clean this up just a tad bit more, so I don't get acrylic in my ink pads. That will ruin your ink pads too. Make sure I don't have any paint on that one. All right. The distress inks, the ink pads, the oxides, and just the distress inks, I really like these a lot. Get that out of the way. All right, so for the oxides, let's do the oxide one. You can use a makeup sponge, perfectly fine. It works nicely. Or you can use a blending tool. Tim Holtz, I believe, has these blending tools. Actually, I think this is my blue one. I use my makeup sponges over and over and over again with my ink pads. And so what I do is I have my ink pad, I have my sponge, and I use a rubber band to keep the sponge with the ink pad. That way I'm not contaminating my ink pads by using different sponges and different inks. And I'm not wasting my sponges. They're right there when I want them. So this is a blending tool. It is Velcro with a little foam pad. And the trick to get this even is to go off the edge and then bring it into the stencil. If you don't do that, then you're going to have little circle marks. But that works really well. Show you circle marks. Of course, it won't do it now. You can see it's a little variegated. There's darker in some places, lighter in others. It works really well. Another one I like to use is the color dusters. I don't know if they make these anymore. This one is a Judikins color duster. It is a soft brush with long bristles, and I like this because, let's go to a different page. Let's just use this. I can load it up with color, kind of like that, and then just kind of dust the color on. It's a lighter, it's not so solid. The darker, the more you do it, the darker it will get. But it's just a light dusting of color. And I really like that too. That's a color duster. If you can't find color dusters, a stencil brush will work. Same kind of thing. You just use a stencil brush with it. I've got ink on here. And another thing to do with the Distress inks, let me move this over just a little bit, is load your stencil up with the ink and take a damp, well, I'm going to use you can use a damp brush or a damp baby wipe. You don't want to use a fresh baby wipe. You want one that's been sitting out just a few minutes. And then brush the color. This one's too wet, so it just kind of absorbed all that color. Let me try it again. As you can see, it's kind of a watercolor effect. Let me use the brush. See if I can get some of that color off of there. I dampen it just a tad. This makes it look a little like watercolor. Well, that was too much water. And what I'm going to do, since it's still pretty wet, I'm just going to turn it over, use a brayer. And it didn't have enough color on it, so it didn't work really well. Oh well. All right. It does usually work a little bit better than that. Let me dry it off just a tad. I'm going to try the oxide and do the same thing. I'm going to load it up with the oxide and use this damp-ish baby wipe and rub the color onto the paper off the stencil. So if you don't use quite so much water, it will work. All right. And I probably have quite a bit of color on my baby wipe, so I can probably just keep on cleaning it off until my stencil is clean and I haven't wasted any of that ink. I just get lighter and lighter little stencils. All right. Another thing to do with stencils, and I might as well use this one since I'm using it all over the place here, layering up the same stencil with different techniques. A lot of fun. I'm going to use a teal, this is a wax crayon, and I'm just going to do a rubbing of the stencil. This works with thinner paper, not so much with cardstock and stuff, because you can't feel the stencil underneath something that's really thick. So, crayon rubbings on a stencil. Let me go down my list here. Let's do this page, and let's do the spray inks. All right. Spray ink through a stencil. We all have the distress sprays, we've got the glimmer mist, we've got all those different things. There is a trick to doing the stencils. If you hold your, and these, it makes a mess. Sprays, spray everywhere. So do it in a box or something. But if you spray from a distance, you get a light stencil. Light color, it's more even all the way around. And if you do it close up, it's darker. So that's the different ways to use the inks. And just so you don't waste it, you know that there's all kinds of ink on your stencil. Flip it over. And I use a brayer just to get that stencil right there on the paper. So no ink is wasted. All right. Sprays are really nice. You can make your own sprays, a little bit of watercolor and some water, and put it in a spray bottle. It works really well too. All right. Let's do watercolor. Let's do some watercolor. I have a watercolor pad here, or tin. This is a piece of plastic, and it's a plastic, there's a plastic. Let me do it on this piece of plastic. You can have a piece of plastic or a plastic bag or any of that kind of thing. Let's see, what color should I use? Let's use some blue. I am going to put some blue watercolor on this piece of plastic with a lot of water. And I'm going to dip my stencil right in there, spread it around, and use my brayer to brayer the color off. So yes, you can use your watercolors with stencils. It can be done. I'm going to do that again. Actually, I shouldn't have done it that way. Let me just brayer this off over here. And let me use this one. A little bit of water, a little bit of watercolor, not too much water. That was too much, but you can watercolor in the stencil as well. If you had a smaller brush with not quite so much water, this one I brush the color underneath the stencil so you can't see the pattern. But if I were to use a mostly dry brush, not very much water, not too much water. You can do it that way. It's not going to be a perfect stencil, which I really like. It's going to be unpredictable. You're going to get surprises. You're going to get something different every time. And I do like that. So It's just one of those things that I enjoy, something different, something unexpected. Just cleaning off my brush here with the watercolor. And that was a really dry brush with the watercolor, and that turned out pretty well. So you can use watercolors with your stencils. And another thing you can use, let me put some more color on my plastic here. I'll use the same stencil. Do the kitchen sponge. And dab it. You get a spotty kind of stencil. All right. You can use a toothbrush. Load up your stencil and do a spray. Oops, where's my stencil? Or load up your brush, put the stencil down in a place where there isn't a bunch of color already. Load up my toothbrush with a little bit of watercolor. This makes a big mess. So splatter in a box or something. But it gives you a watercolor splatter stencil kind of thing, which is kind of fun. And then you've got watercolor on your stencil again. So brayer it off somewhere that you would like it. Don't let any of that color go to waste. All right. My finger is very watercolory now. And the last thing that I like to do, I'll use this one. Actually, I'll use that side. I'll use this stencil. Embossing. Let's end it with embossing. All right, embossing powder and embossing ink pad. Mine has seen better days, but I like the fact that it's a little darker, so I can kind of see where the ink is. So I just press the ink through the stencil. Like that. Sprinkle it with the embossing powder. I tap it a little bit to get to all the little places. Make sure it's well covered. Okay. And I'm going to use the heat tool. So if you're sensitive to noise, I'm going to turn it on. And there you go. You can stamp, you can emboss with your stencils. It's a nice raised bit now, and it's a fun little bit to have. So get your stencils out, practice a little bit. And one more thing I wanted to show you. If you don't have an ink duster, a color duster, I got this makeup sponge, makeup brush at the Dollar Tree. It's a little softer than the ink dusters, but they still work. Let me use this stencil. Actually, it's got stuff on it, so let me get that off. All right. The way you use one of these is you kind of hold the bristles so that they're just a little bit stiffer. You load it up the same way you would an ink duster. And you just rub it on. And it works really well. So you don't need to make it that dark. You can make a light color dusting with the ink that's left on there. So it's a nice light color of dust. See, I like this one. Make sure that you use the same color with it. There's still ink on this. This is my red one, and I really should mark it red underneath here. If you put this in any other ink pad, you'll transfer this red to the other ink pad, so you'll contaminate your ink pads. So I make sure that I've got one for every color that I use. So just so you know, don't contaminate everything. So I think that is everything. That's quite a few different things to do with stencils. Stencils don't have to be perfect to be cool. You can layer them up like I was doing with the first page. I'm not sure where the first page went to. You can use the same stencil, different techniques, different paints on top of each other to layer up your page, or you can use different stencils to layer and kind of run into each other. I use different colors of ink, just slightly different colors of ink, a bunch of different stencils, and that made this background. Stencils can be really fun. They don't have to be perfect. So, you know, if they're just a little bit imperfect and they've got a little bit of ink underneath, it still makes great color. So don't worry too much. If you really don't like it, you can collage something on top of it. So I will be continuing on adding more and more layers to these pages with mixed media in simple steps. Thanks for watching.